Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. You may have recognized this outfit and backdrop before because I forgot to record the intro to this video before I chatted with our guest today. We have our special guest, Joi Mahon. And so I'm very excited to share this interview with you. Joi is a powerhouse in the sewing education world. She has been working with designing and making her own clothes since she was a teenager, working for a tailor and doing 4-H, and then went to school for fashion design and now has had a many year career in it and has written several best-selling books. And her latest is what we're talking about today, The Illustrated Guide to Sewing Clothes. I dabble in garment sewing, among other different crafts, mostly for my kids because they have straight bodies. We do not have to deal with the curves of the female body. But lately I've been trying to do more alterations to that because one of my daughters is very slim. We kind of talk about it a little bit in the interview. And so I've been watching videos. I've been searching the internet, trying to find tutorials on how to do different things. And it is time consuming and you're not always sure if you've gotten good information. And let me tell you, when I was looking through this book, like, all my questions were answered in this book. So you can stop searching the internet. You can stop trying to decide if this tutorial is telling you the right way to do it or if you should listen to that one. It is all in here. There are pictures that tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing and telling you kind of how to read the wrinkles is how she calls it. And it is just so, it just is eye-opening, just eye-opening. And the attention to detail is significant. Like, for example, I want to make a coat for my kids and I want to do what's called pad stitching, which helps shape the lapels. It's a custom fit tailoring technique that helps them lay where they're supposed to lay. I know what pad stitching is. I know in theory how it's done. I had no idea how you would do it without having the stitching come through to the right side of the fabric until I read this book, and she very clearly said you need 2 layers. And I'm like, of course that makes sense. It's like when you're quilting and stitching your binding on and you just conceal those stitches in the batting layer. And it's just like, it's like eye-opening stuff that's basic that I like I've searched for this so much on the internet, cannot find it. And there are so many answers to questions like that in this book. If you are dabbling in sewing for clothes, you need this book in your sewing library. It's great. All right, so Joi has done a lot of work both for her own business and also teaching for Babylock, teaching for Nancy's Notions. And so today is just a really exciting interview. I encourage you to check her out. And then also you can grab the book from us. So we are by the same publisher. Both of our books are published by Landauer. So it's great to have another member of the family here with me today. So let's get on with the chat. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me today. And we're here to talk about your brand new book, Ultimate Illustrated Guide to Sewing Clothes. So this book has pretty much everything one needs to know to get started sewing. We talk about the different types of fabric. We have pretty much every alteration that needs to be made to make it fit correctly. You talk about even the little things like using the correct interfacing to make lapels lie flat. I mean, like, I dabble in sewing garments, and these are things that I've spent hours and hours Googling. So how did this book come to be? And especially to have so much content in it that really it's like your Bible. If you want to sew clothes, like, this will have everything you need to know when you get stuck. So how did this book come to be?
Sure. Well, I think the timing was really good. A kind of a precursor to the beginning of the book is that, like a lot of people, I started sewing when I was fairly young, and some people, go away from sewing and then pick it back up. But I had a really great kind of career before this, as far as I worked for a tailor through high school, did a lot of apprenticing, really had the opportunity to literally learn all different types of garments and fit. And then I studied fashion design in college, which is kind of like that launching off point. I've had a career over 25 years with a brick and mortar location and studio where I do custom design. And so it's not just writing, but actually it's kind of like having this opportunity to go back and like teach skills that you use. And so I've written 2 titles prior to this, and the acquisition editor for this particular book, I've known her for several years. I actually worked with her on my prior titles. And so she kind of reached out to me and just said, hey, you're really someone that's at the forefront for putting this title together. So number one, like, that's a big honor to be asked, but then it's really kind of in reflecting on it now that it's a real, title and it's available for everyone, it's kind of exciting to look back. And one thing that I did in writing this, because it is a large book, it's almost 300 pages. So it really, obviously you can never include every single thing that's out there, but it really is a solid resource for everybody. But reflecting on that, everything that I put in there, I resewed samples for everything. I thought, if I'm going to teach this, no sewer does every single technique, every single day. And so if you don't do something regularly, you do become rusty. So I wanted it to be very real. And so with the exception of just a couple photos that were provided by the company, I did every single step out in there, all the samples and all of that. So it was just kind of a fun way for me too, to just, hey, like, yeah, these are all my skills, and sharing that with everybody.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, it's fabulous. I mean, I primarily sew for my daughters who are, they're straight. There's there's not really much alterations that have to go with it, but my older daughter is very slim. So lately I've been learning how to alter size 7 patterns to have the size 4 waist. And that's challenging because there are lots of videos out there, but there's no one resource where you can go and just like get it all. Like you're like evaluating, does this YouTuber really know what they're talking about? Or, what about this article, and what sort of underlayments and interfacings do you need to have in order to make it work properly? And so this is one that I get a lot of books, but this is one that I'm going to like have as my reference going forward as I have questions. So I think it's a really great title. So let's talk through like some of the things that you wanted to put in there, and why you really, I mean, it is just so complete. I really love the way the book is structured and all the step-by-step illustrated guides to go with it. So when you were challenged and talked with to do this title, like, was that your goal? Like, let's make this the Bible to go to if someone has a question?
Sure. Well, so when there's this concept of like the ultimate illustrated guide of sewing, I mean, that's a big title, so it's kind of like narrowing down. And like I mentioned, there are things that aren't in this. The wonderful thing about sewing is that there's always scads of things that you can learn. And so nobody ever knows it all. But, there are core things, and there's kind of a balance of not being so basic that, I mean, there's a lot of super basic resources out there that are, like something that would come with your sewing machine, a manual, like that's so basic, but you need something to grow with. But also I'm a big believer in what I call real content. And what I mean by that is just, there's theory out there in sewing, and there's even, like I said, those basic skills, but really things that are real life. It's one thing, even in fitting, like you mentioned, it's one thing to read a blog post from someone who writes a theory about fitting, but it's another thing to like apply that to your own project. And so kind of, evaluating those things that are going to be, good core skills that people can study and learn, and have enough depth to it where, like I said, they can really learn something and then grow and then build on your skills. So I think that was really like the first thing. It was like, okay, let's make in working with the editors and the proposals, like trying to narrow down, okay, let's cover this content in this section. And then part of the process of this book is that I actually proposed to them that we add the pant fitting workshop. I've done 2 previous titles, and really like being aware of books that are out there in the sewing industry right now, there's not a lot of really good pant content out there, or titles, or meaning books that are really dedicated to that. Or if they are, they're like from the 70s, and they're not really relevant to bodies of today. And I've done pant fitting for a long time, kind of based off of my approach to fitting pants, or fitting patterns in general, but how I apply that to pants. And I've done a lot of live workshops. I do them here at my studio. And so I've worked with individuals. And so for me, it was really important to kind of apply that real approach to fitting, because I've seen not just models, but people that have curves and lumps and bumps and things like that. So at the beginning, I went to them and I said, can we have enough space to incorporate, this particular section? So that was kind of a separate piece that we were able to add to the book, which again, really, if you're talking the ultimate guide to sewing, it really needs to include pants. So so that was really just the first step, was evaluating, what are we going to be able to include in this?
Well, and like that specific section, that one was like a light bulb moment for me when I was looking at it, because the illustrations show two slim models. One of them has a very flat derriere, for lack of a better phrase, and then the other has a rounded one. And both look great. Both require two completely different pant shapes in order to make it look as good as it could and live its best day. And that is like just not something that I would have even thought about when it came to fitting things. Like, oh, well, yes, obviously that would make sense. Someone might be a size 2, but the measurements in different areas may still be different. And it just blows my mind how much is out there that one could learn in terms of fitting things perfectly.
Yeah. And I think just like on pants alone, there's a lot of like just basic things that are just continually taught in pant fitting, but there's this kind of lack of, well, what you're referring to is really like that, the crotch curve, or some people call it the saddle. But it's almost like, people's weight, if you think of putting a hula hoop around your waist, and some people, like if you had a hula hoop, it might tilt forward, or like a gyroscope, or it might tilt backwards or to the side, or, like we all aren't like this level body that we often see coming out of the pattern envelope. And a lot of times the pattern is what people will complain, like, oh, I wish pattern companies would make patterns that fit real people. Well, they can't make a custom pattern for every single person. Like your pattern, it's not the pattern, it's just a tool, regardless of what size it is. I mean, really, it doesn't matter. That's just your starting point, but it's that whole transition into like the real body. But pants are really interesting because, you can research scads of articles from the last probably 20 years, and you'll see like the same repetition in like how you fit pants, but it's always assuming that you have like this figure that has like this normal tilt of the pelvis and things like that. And they really forget to address that custom shape of the body. So that's just one big element, where in the book on the page where I do the little template for that, I call it the crotch curve template. And my students, when they, especially in live classes, which we've not had a ton of that since COVID, but I did a few pant retreats last year, some smaller groups, and that's something that I've done for several years. That one element, when you fit people in real life, it is like this giant light bulb. And the fact that I don't have to make 10 sample pants, I can just make a template and get that shape that matches my body, and then I can lay that over other patterns, and then that will match my body. It's really cool. I mean, it's kind of a life changer. So.
It is really cool. I mean, as I get old, I've always had a thing for fashion. Like I worked at a fashion store when I was in my early 20s, and probably spent my entire paycheck on the clothing there. Sure. And like it's, I've always had a thing for it. And as I get older, I like that custom fit, but Lord knows I don't have the skill set to do it for myself yet. And I've always gravitated to making things for the kids because it's easier. You can just do their waist measurement and you're good. It's going to fit. But it's, I made one thing for myself that fits properly, and it was with help. And I would love to change that. And I think that this book could potentially do that. So that's good. Yeah. So tell me more about your background. You started sewing when you were young?
I did. Yeah. So when I was very young, I started sewing, and at that point I obviously wasn't any good, but I just have always gravitated to like the needle arts. And I mean, I remember going to my grandparents' farm, and my grandma sewed, and she didn't necessarily sit me down and say, hey, here's how you do it. But she was very inspirational as far as like, here, she would buy me sewing things, and I would play in her sewing stash. And you can't see it, but I have her sewing machine and like jars of all all her sewing notions like over here in my studio, and things that I don't remember specifically, but I'm sure that they were ones that I dabbled and played with when I was young. But I think that that was just really, influential. And so that I think was just kind of that launching off point. I started sewing more seriously in about 5th and 6th grade. 6th grade was really pivotal. I joined 4-H. And so we had a 4-H mom who she taught a lesson on making a jacket out of like quilting cottons, but she was one of those teachers who was, you sew and then you rip it out and you sew it and you redo every step until it's perfect. And it took like weeks to make this project, and but it was like perfect once it was done. And I don't teach that way. I teach more to the love and the passion, because perfection comes with doing something. We're in this like fast-paced society, but it's a skill. So I always say it's like learning the piano. Like you don't skip the intermediate recital just because you're not Beethoven or the maestro. And sewing is a lot like that. But yeah, and so it was one of those things that it really clicked for me. So I was very good at sewing, to the point that when I was in high school, I was hired by a tailor, and not like I was still learning, but I had the ability that I could fit suits, and I did our professional accounts and all kinds of garment types. So it just was something that I was really good at. And then I studied fashion design in college, where I got more of the technical learning as far as draping and pattern making, other manufacturing, some more of like the fashion industry side of things as well. But all of those things are always like, you have to do it though. And so starting my own business, I mean, I could give you stories and examples of, just everything that I've done the past 25 years just to, build on that content.
So how did you transition more into teaching and writing books as well?
That's a good question. I think that's something that does happen a little naturally when you do something for so long, and I don't feel like there is always something new to learn, but I don't feel like I'm seeking out a lot of classes right now. I think there's a point where like there are, when you kind of master certain things, that people start asking you questions, or they see your work. And again, not that I don't have things to learn. I always want to keep that at the forefront, because I do truly believe like you always can improve, and there's new fabrics and new body types and new combinations of everything. So you do always have to make sure your skills are, like that continuing education. But and I do think that's important to say, because just kind of to interject, I think a lot of sewers, like you even mentioned, like you're still learning to fit or things like that. And that's just a part of what we do. And I think that I love continual learning. And so I feel that in teaching, that's part of my job, is to really encourage my students that, number one, it's okay to mess up. Like that's part of the process. And really kind of embrace that, because another thing, even with teaching, is that if you do something right the first time, sometimes you haven't had the best learning experience. Whereas if you have someone who maybe messes up, or they struggle and they're asking questions and they have to redo something, but at the end of their process, maybe they don't have the perfect item, but they have such a better understanding of the dynamics of, okay, now I know why that didn't work, or now I know why it did work. Now I can improve upon it. And that's part of really knowing what you're doing, is that you have to know what doesn't work along with, those experiences. So I love that whole learning process. So yeah, as far as, like I said, people reach out and ask you, I started writing articles. It's been maybe 15, 16 years ago for a couple publications. And I would submit different projects and like Sew News, and there were some other crafting magazines and embroidery magazines and things like that. So I would start there, mainly more just as a, hey, I have an idea. Do you want to put this in the magazine? I really wasn't thinking so much about the education. But actually back to high school, I taught my first sewing lesson when I was 15, because in 4-H, because sewing was my category, that was really an area that really cultivated, if you had an interest, 4-H was really good about, okay, now share it with somebody else. So I would coordinate workshops, and I didn't realize that till a couple years ago. And I thought, wow, that was really like my first time being a teacher. And I didn't really really think about it. But yeah, but I think, yeah, probably the last 10-ish, 12 years, just, working with different companies and being asked to come in and talk to either their employees or to some of their like sewing machine dealerships, and doing like a craftsy class. And then, people, and it's like music, people either like you or don't like you as a teacher, and then they gravitate to you. And yeah, so just kind of grows from there. But I think it's a natural progression.
And I know, like, for me, like, starting to watch Project Runway in my 20s, I would always end up at a store trying to buy stuff thinking I could do it, and it very rarely turned out accurate. But it was fun. It was a fun process, and I feel like, especially in the last couple of years, people have been gravitating back toward that slower process. People are becoming aware of fast fashion. They're becoming aware of the quality of things, and they're getting back to doing things and making things themselves, not because they need to save money, because we all know it doesn't.
Right.
But
No.
but it's fun. The process is enjoyable, and at the end of the day, you have a fabulous thing that you've made. And when someone compliments you on your outfit, you get to say, "Oh, I made that."
Yeah, no, that's so true. And even, even with sewing, I think it's like with the pandemic, there's all those jokes about like sewers, like we were prepared for just a time as this, but, but really, what a great outlet for just, stress release, or like that creative outlet, or, when we've been stuck at home, like I have a studio to go to, and you do, but a lot of people are like stuck at home. And so, having, something where you can kind of forget about what's going on. And I just think it's very therapeutic. I think there's that would be an interesting topic to kind of study, like the therapeutic side. I have a lot of students actually who are like doctors or physician's assistants, not all of them, but I'm surprised like at how many are. And so I don't know if there's a link there, or if it's a mindset. I don't know what the link is, but I do think that there's probably some insight to that. But, what a viable career. We're seeing a lot of, big corporations that close, but, a skill set that, if you have a small family, you can add to the income, or, sell your sewing or your creative skills. So, I mean, there's a lot of insight into sewing, just besides being able to create something, which ultimately is like the most exciting part. But there's definitely a kind of a tier to what sewing gives to people, I think.
To me, it's always about like learning the next thing. Like, one of the YouTube channels that I watch all the time is Bernadette Banner, who just sews Victorian clothing based on the sewing methods and tools available at the time, which is not something I ever have a desire to do myself. But I love watching it, and the attention to detail, it just like feeds my soul, and I get so excited about it. And so that's like when I'm making clothes for my kids. I mean, I know that I work a lot on my sewing machine, and I'm a serger, so I know I can overlock, but I'm often like doing the French seam or figuring out how to do the lining, so that way I don't have to have the raw exposed edges, and it can just look better than what you would purchase in the store. And to me, that's the exciting part of learning like the new thing. Like, one of the things I was really excited to see in here was the explanation of the layering of interfacing that happens inside of coat lapels, because that is so hard to find. I have spent so many hours searching for this, and like I know in theory what's supposed to go in it, but it was the first time I'd ever seen that it's 2 layers. And then the light bulb clicked. I'm like, this is why pad stitching works, because it's going to get hidden in the layers and not be visible from the right side. And I'm just like, it's like those light bulb moments that happen. Like for me, like when I quilted, I did not know when I started that there was a difference between a regular presser foot and a 1/4 inch presser foot. So for a year, I sewed an incredibly accurate 3/8 inch seam and could not figure out why it wasn't a 1/4 inch. And then I finally had a teacher look at me and go, that's not the right foot. And then I immediately was like off to the races. I was doing really well as soon as I figured that out. But it's just like things like that that you don't have access to a lot of times. And I feel like it's very hard to find classes like what you offer in person. Like that just isn't, it doesn't exist. So to have resources like that available, are just, in book format, so you're not spending hours and hours searching the internet trying to find it. Like, that's just fabulous.
Yeah, interfacing is really, again, like I spent, 4 years in high school, 3.5. I always look back, I'm like, I think it was October, but it's like I can remember it was either right before or right after Christmas. So give or take 3.5 years. And then a few years when I was in college, when I would come back and then work in the summers and over break and things like that. But I tell you, that tailoring experience, one big thing that I took away from tailoring, because we did ladies, and really a lot of ladies quote tailoring falls in the title of like alterations. So true tailoring, and I think it's getting better for sure, but a lot of like what we would do on like the suit accounts for like men's suits, you'd have like these beautiful layers, or like these men's suits have these shoulder pads, and I always call them the kidney because it's a shoulder, like a shoulder shape, but it looks like a giant kidney. But when you take that to a woman's tailored jacket, like it because it's so large, it feels like the whole front area and wraps over the shoulder, and it just makes like this beautiful foundation. And you don't see those beautiful things inside ladies' garments. Like if you go to the store and buy them, you are not going to find those. I mean, maybe super high-end garments. And so really one thing was like, why don't you, or like sleeve wiggin is something that is used in like the cuff of nicer men's suits. And it's like a barrier so that when you have the roll over of the cuff, like better clothing doesn't have like a sharp, crisp fold to it. It's like this nice roll. Like it still has a nice finish. It's not like unpressed, but it's not just like you folded something in half and you pressed a hard crease on it. Like it's this nice roll. And so the sleeve wiggin is like this odd like tailoring tool, but I was always like, why don't we put that in women? So even in college, I would put those things in like my women's garments, and like I would win the fashion shows because my garments were really well sewn, and things like that. But yeah, like, you know, interfacing really can be a fun thing, like doing a dress for someone, you know, taking an interfacing and making, and we're talking the interfacing because some people might not know. So you have like your pretty fabric that you see on the outside, and then you have your lining, and it's not unlike quilting where you have the batting in between the layers, and unlike like in quilting, you might stitch through all the layers, and sometimes you'll do that in garments as well. But having like this inner layer that you can shape, I'm working on a pageant gown right now, for like a world pageant, and so it's this beautiful sculpted interfacing that has boning, and we're fitting that because it's like your undergarment. That's the structure of your garment, and they can be very over the top or they can be very simple, but that's really one thing I think that is overlooked. You don't get that in a pattern envelope. You know, it might say fuse some interfacing or interface with a sew in, but it isn't that depth. And yeah, so here, do you want a fun interfacing tip?
I do, but I want to say real quick for our quilters who don't fully grasp the differences of this. It's like if you have a different types of batting and different densities of quilting will give you different drape for your quilt. And so people, I think, understand that. If you have a nice soft interfacing and you quilt it very loosely, it's going to be very drapey, versus like say if you decide to layer wool and polyester together and quilt it densely, it's going to look beautiful, but it's going to be very flat. It's not going to be as comfy for your everyday quilt, but it's going to look fabulous. And that's what interfacing can do. But like you said, the pattern envelope will just say use interfacing, and then you have to figure out which one of the dozens that are available at your local store, and probably the hundreds, maybe thousands that are available that you could get that you probably can't get locally as well.
Well, and for your quilting audience too, I have a tabletop tiara, tabletop long arm, and I quilt a ton of linings for my garments. Number one, it looks really cool, but also there are times where, you know, maybe I'm adding, like I use it's a garment flannel, and so think of like a baby flannel. It's more dense, but it does have some drape to it, but it's not like the printed quilting flannel flannels that you might have, but it's flannel, but it just comes in like a plain white. I get it from a industry guy in the garment industry. But a lot of times I will stitch a layer of that. So if I have a pattern piece, say it's just like the bodice front, like the front, which might also have a side, and then there's a seam joining them together. So I will take the lining, and I will put that flannel on the back of the lining and then sew around it. So it's all in essence one piece. And then depending on how I'm assembling the garment, a lot of times I will go in and quilt guidelines on there as a placement line for placing boning. And by the time you have this garment that is done, and I wish I had I was thinking I needed a photo of an inside of one of mine, but really by the time it's done, if you were to look at the inside of the garment, it has beautiful stitching on it, but also you'll see that the lines, maybe as I join a seam, then they match. And so you might have a continuous line going across a bodice, even though there's vertical seams on it, but also those lines next to them are going to be pieces of boning stitch. Because in garment, and I won't get in too depth, but in garment construction, again, a lot of garment patterns will have you put a piece of boning maybe on the side seam or down the bust seam, but they really don't address putting boning in the middle of the seam. But you wouldn't sew that to the outside of the fabric because you don't want the stitching lines, but you still need some sort of structure. So that's where kind of some of those quilting crossovers really come into the mix, and it makes glorious, I mean, just beautiful garments. And so there are a lot of like crossover applications, and in quilting, you use your piecing foot. I use that in garments along with like a microtex needle for like really precision. So if you have some of those areas that, it's important when the lines, and the points come together, and that's the same in garment sewing as well. And so using some of those techniques, I dabble, like we were talking earlier, that you dabble in clothing, and I'm the opposite. I dabble in quilting. That's kind of my casual off time sewing, whereas like clothing's my area of expertise. But it does amaze me how some of those techniques really can cross over.
My biggest back and forth is remembering where my seam allowance is supposed to be. Like I have to think very hard about that because I'm just so used to like 1/4 inch lining up the edge of the press foot. And then that's not always the case. And sometimes it changes depending on where you're at in the garment and what the pattern is calling for. And so that always has to throw me. But it's fun sewing now with my daughter who's 7, and we're working on a princess gown right now. And just for no purpose other than the fabric was fun. And so it's fun to work with her on it and see her and kind of explain things of like, this is why we're doing this. She's not super excited about the bodice. She's very excited about the skirt. But, they have their things. But it's fun to see like the little ones get excited because I don't know if this happened to you. I was teaching quilting classes probably by the time I was 26, 7, somewhere thereabouts. So a lot of times I would walk in and they would expect me to be the student and I was the instructor because I had already been doing it for so long and like daily, because like we talked about earlier, it is a great form of stress relief, and I had a stressful job. So I sewed every single day. And, but like just to see like where they might go, like, if they start so young, like you did, like I did, and just have fun with it. It's really fun to see.
I took a survey of some of my closer core students, and my median age for my students is 60 to 75, which, so some of them have been sewing technically longer than I have, but I also find that they're in like the history of sewing there, when embroidery machines came out in like the late 90s, early 2000, and the first technology, wasn't that great, but, as embroidery machines and quilting machines have really exploded in the technology, there was a little bit of a pivot. So you see much more dedication to quilting and embroidery. And so kind of circling back to the clothing and what you were saying earlier, that it really is, it's coming back. But what I found is that a lot of my students, maybe they sewed clothing for themselves or their kids when they were younger, and then they started, had a job or a career or whatever, and then they're coming back to sewing, and a lot are coming from quilting, and they're just different. I don't think quilting competes with clothing at all, because honestly, my garment sewers that have quilted, there's a certain eye for precision, and in quilting, like, why that's so important. Otherwise, if you're off on cutting, your quilt blocks aren't, like, if you have one quilt block that's like off slightly, it does throw off a quilt. And so those are definitely some skills that cross over. And so there's just, yeah, I think a lot of back and forth. I guess maybe that's kind of a common theme with the sewing and my thought process too.
I'm a very anal retentive sewer. And I have been my entire life. I remember sewing with, like, I got my first sewing machine for Christmas from one set of grandparents, and then the other grandma was making a doll dress with me. And she was born in Italy, did not come here until she was an adult, so she did not read or write in English or Italian. And I remember I'm like trying to read the pattern for her, which she didn't even need. But I'm like very much trying to follow the instructions at like a little kid. I was maybe 7 or 8. And I could just, now I recognize that she was probably really frustrated with me because I was just trying to do it by the book. And just doll clothes are hard in general. And I just remember her ending it by going, next time we make it something for you, because she was just, it's just so much easier to make it a little bit larger scale. But it sounds fun to make it, for the little doll. And, those memories are great.
That's funny. Yeah, what's really fun is when you have a garment class and you have quilters, and I tell them that they can't use their rulers or their rotary cutters, which you could totally use in garment sewing, but sometimes I'll be like, okay, no rotary cutters, and they're like, wait, what do I do? So yeah, that's fun.
I would have a hard time with that. A really hard time.
Although, I have one of those rulers that has I always forget what it's called. It's got the big clear ruler, and then it has the mounted blade on it, and you just roll it. It's over on my cutting table. I'm totally drawing a blank, but that's a quilting ruler. But honestly, that is fantastic for waistbands. I have a section of the year where I do dance costumes for a studio over near Detroit. And so it's kind of like this fast pace, about 6 weeks of like their competitive things. And I cut so many waistbands and a lot of like elastic bands. And so that ruler saves my time, just by placing that on there. It cuts spandex, and it's marketed to quilting, but there you go. There's another kind of full circle.
So what's like your ratio of like sewing for hire, like you're making something or altering something, versus teaching versus, whatever else it is you do to like have your business?
Question. I get that question quite a lot too. COVID, of course, threw a little monkey wrench in everything, because that whole 2020. So I would say, like, on an ideal year, right now we're still doing so much online education, but I was doing quite a good chunk of that prior. So it wasn't a big, for me, it wasn't a big, brick wall. It was just like, okay, I'm just going to do more of that. But in 2020, I have a studio here where students can come and learn. So I have an on-site classroom, and I've had this for about 6 years now. Prior to that, and I would still travel, but prior to that, I would lease the Stony Creek Conference Center down here in Sioux City. And so for three to 4 years prior to that, I would do a big event in the summer called Sewing Holiday. And so that was kind of how I would bring people to my area, but also traveling. So like you, I have, although my kids are a little older now, I have a one going to college and then one going to middle school, but, paying attention to, my family has always been, I don't travel every weekend. So my rule of thumb was like 6 events a year at the most, pre-COVID. Of course, my kids are a little older now. But then as far as doing online events or Zoom retreats or things like that, that's really easy to do. I've got a studio here, different areas where I can film. home, and then we can teach live. So currently I do 3 to 4 live classes a week, along with other, other things. I have a private club, my Perfect Pattern and Fit Club, which would be awesome for you. We're doing 4 core garment projects this year. So each quarter we're doing a different core garment piece with the idea that we're taking it start to finish. So some of my students aren't going to be interested in learning to make their pattern, but that's a lesson in there. How do they use a basic sloper pattern and then do the design work, add the seam allowance, do the garment fitting, do the muslin fitting, and then sew the garment. And actually, and that was a little different this year. I decided to do as many Zoom as I needed to do these fitting evaluations for my students. And I cannot believe how that really just kind of blew up in a good way. And several people, again, my median, my 60 to 75-year-olds, they've sewn longer than I have, but they're, I was surveying them and asking them to define your skill level, which doesn't always equate to how long you have sewn. Like that's 2 different things. You can sew shorter, but have higher skills, and it's different for everybody. But so many of them commented that, I've taken classes and I've watched this, and people say, read this line, read the pattern, whatever, but nobody's ever really shown me. And so what I did was I had everyone send their pictures. And so we did a live Zoom. And so I would just go in order. I would pull, a person's pictures up, and I would say, okay, and we're all doing the same garment right now. But what's really cool about that is that sometimes we only fit ourselves. And so if you're a person who never sews for other people, like you don't have that spectrum of like really understanding different things and fit as well. And so they're all getting to learn how to fit their own garments, but they're also starting to recognize, how do you read a sample garment like a muslin when you're like, how do you read the wrinkles? How do you fix those fit issues? And so I just evaluate them, and I'll do top to bottom, front to back. Okay, here's your garment. Here's what I see going on. Here's how you fix it. And so many of them have emailed me privately just saying that that was just like mind blowing. And so that's kind of been one thing that I've been implementing a lot more of this year. I wish I would have thought of doing more of that last year, but it's just kind of developed into that. So yeah, generally I do travel and do classes, but again, it's been more limited with COVID and still a lot of places like travel. So yeah, so a lot of online right now, and that's really just pretty much available, as needed. But yeah.
That is like we were pretty well positioned when everything hit, because all our inventory was already online and shoppable. And so when everyone was trying to like sell on Facebook Lives and say, comment if you want, number, whatever, like sure, we just you could go and check out. You didn't have to do anything. And so for us, like we've grown pretty significantly. And also we closed our brick and mortar store and haven't reopened because we found that focusing on the online component has been a more profitable use of our time. We miss our in-person people, but it's strange. Like, if you've dabbled a little bit before, or you're in a good position, like I feel like those are the folks who have been able to really reach a lot of people who are still craving that, because it's a social thing. It feels social when you're sitting and chatting, or maybe listening to our conversation. And it's fun, but to see how it all changes and still bring that joy,
kind of filled in the gaps, from what, I still, on a given day, I would take a live class over, an online class anytime, because there are elements of a live class where, you get kind of that banter back and forth, or, if you're watching a class and you can't see all the other students, or, like in sewing, or especially like when I'm teaching fitting, it's really fun to say, okay, like, can I get any volunteers? And people are awesome. So, there's a lot of funny things that go on in fit classes that you just have to be there, but being able to like, oh, here's Betsy, and okay, let's talk about her shoulder, or like her hip curve, and and there's just funny joking things that that come up, but people really appreciate that and seeing that. So yeah, a live class really, I think, is the ultimate experience. But the technology and people are more receptive to it, and I think we're doing what we can to fill in, and yeah, and it's great fun. The advantage though too is that you can have have, not every student can come see me, and I can't go see every student like you can't, but you can still reach that more broad audience, because I'm sure you do, but like I have students in Canada and in the UK and Australia and other countries. And so obviously like I'm probably never ever going to see them, but it's great. And I feel like I know a lot of them. And so when they're on a Zoom, I mean, that's really, I mean, you really are making those connections. So there's certainly something to say about that as well.
Yes, we definitely see that as well with our people. So what do you do for fun sewing, or do you even get time to do fun sewing? Because I know that in my personal life, sometimes there isn't time.
That's true. There is, I feel like I get to play every day. I will never say that I've never, and I don't get challenging projects, like, in anything, like some of the garments that I do are very complex. Like some aren't, like not everything has to be super highly tailored. I always tell my students too, it's okay to have like a 1 hour t-shirt, like that's totally fine. But some garments that I do, if I have a challenging, custom client, in that where like maybe we have a specific fit need that we're doing, or we're working with a unique fabric, or maybe it takes a couple adjustments because of how their sleeve works. I mean, sometimes I have those where, and I like problem solving. So to me, like I really like gravitate to that. So it's not ooh, I'm having fun. It's more like I'm thinking really hard while I'm sewing. So I wouldn't say that that's leisure sewing, but I definitely thrive in that. So I mean, honestly, like any sewing really. I do sew for my kids, not as much. I haven't done a ton for my daughter in probably several years, but she kind of got out of the cute little girl dresses phase, and then they're like, Mom, don't sew for me. But my son, I made him a cute vest. He loves trains, so I made him like a train vest here a while back. I'm trying to think what else. I think that I guess maybe I've not done as much for my kids, but I do like that. I do sew for myself. I like to shop too. So sometimes there's this people will just assume like, oh, you make all of your clothes. And I make a lot of my clothes. Like I have a lot of clothes. I have racks here, but I like to shop too. I'm a normal person. So, that's fun as well. But I sew a lot of like, I do, I guess, a whole variety for myself. So anytime I can, I definitely, like sewing for myself. But one thing I hate to sew is patches. And my husband and my son are in Scouts and Eagle Scout. And so they always have like patches for their uniform. And I don't know what it is. I just do not enjoy that. And it doesn't take any time at all, but it's like, oh, really? I have to sew on another patch. So yeah, that's about it.
My husband ripped a pair of jeans within about a week of me buying it, and it's like a very badly placed hole, and I will not fix it. I'm like, just toss the jeans. But he wears them all the time, and he made some dig in front of his mother. It's just like, he's like, too bad I don't know anybody who sews.
I know.
And she's like, I used to patch clothes all the time. I'm like, I don't care to do it. I don't care to do it.
Yeah, it's like I'm kind of been there, done that. And alterations are kind of the same way. Like it's few and far between that I'll do even alterations. I don't need to do that in the studio. Usually if it's somebody that I know and they have like a wedding gown or something real important, but it's like I usually just tell people go to the dry cleaner, or I have a lady that I refer them to. It's like I've done literally, I'm not kidding, thousands of jeans hems. Like I don't need to do another one, and it's a time thing. That's the other thing that I think I've always heard, even my husband's always said this too, like he works in business and he's always like, friends and family sometimes can be like your worst customers, because sometimes they don't realize that like I do run a sewing business. Like it's not a hobby, like this is a business, although it is a hobby too. So it's hard to, like he has a hard time, like he's like, either it's a business or a hobby. I'm like, no, it's both. Like I love it. But you can be so broad that you don't have a focus. And so there's that element too, that, I really focus on certain garment types. So if someone came in and they were like, make me a Harley leather jacket, like, could I do it? I've got the machines, but I don't focus in that. So it would be too far. Like I'd have to reset everything. And so I wouldn't do that. Just not that I can, I just don't, and so there's that element too of I think there's some little bit of that, because sometimes those little projects, people that are like, hey, I know you probably probably get this, right? Your family, and they're like, hey, I know you know how to sew. Can you just fix this little thing? But it's like, if I have 10 little things, like that takes like 3 hours of my day, you know, and when I could do something else that I'd rather do, you know, than fix a jeans hole or something. So yeah.
I remember I had a great uncle who asked if I could make him an extra large king quilt so that would hang very far down on the sides. He's like, I'll pay you for your time. I'm sitting here thinking, I think your idea of paying me for my time is probably gonna be like $10 an hour. And I need to make a lot more than that because this is a business. And it's
like, do you know what the billable rate is when you call the plumber or the computer tech or the electrician? Like,
it's just not, it's, people don't always get it. They're like, well, it's your job. I'm like, well, not that. Like, I need something that I can teach other people to do and then sell them the things to make it if they feel so inspired to do it. And that's how we make money. But
for sure. And there's an element too, like, you know, because we're artists. I mean, there's an art to it as well. I mean, it's the business, but it is an art, you know, and it's a product. And so there is an element of like, you're like, maybe emotionally attached to what you do. Like there's meaning behind what I think a lot of what we do. So it's not like just going to work and you're off at the end of the day. Like a lot of us creative types, you know, we take our work home, or, you know, an idea pops into our head, or we think of a customer or something, you know, or, ooh, this would be a great quilt fabric for this person, or this would be a great garment fabric. And so there's this, I think we're very in tune, I think, to our work, maybe a lot more than some people might that are just, you know, turn the computer off at the end of the day and they're done. And I think that's where sometimes people that and like I said, I'm sure you can relate to this, you know, people that, you know, or like I'll have people that are like, oh, I saw a sewing machine at the Goodwill, and I'm like, okay, I don't need one, you know. It's just like, you know, so some things like you're not interested in because it's not in that scope of like what you do. So I mean, it wasn't really a question that you asked, but I think that is a hard, and I think a lot of people relate to that because we do take our sewing seriously, and it's not that like, hey, just sew on a button. So
yeah, it's a whole different, it can be a pain. But for me, like I'm always sewing something for a video tutorial, and I very rarely get to do like me projects. Like I had some friends over at the studio and we were sewing last weekend, and I was doing work sewing all day, but I was giving them the tour, and we got to the back room, which someday is going to be a dressing room / fabric storage for me. And I have stacks of like scrapbook cases filled with UFOs. It's a lot. It's a significant amount. And then, so we were
one or two, right? One or two.
Oh, well, yeah, times like maybe 20 or 30. And it's a lot. But like for me, like my fun stuff, if I would have gotten to do anything, I would have been working on like finishing something, a clothing garment for my daughters, because it's so far removed from what I do in my day-to-day that's what feels like the fun sewing for me. I told my husband not that long ago, I was like, my ideal, like someday I want to do this. I want to go to New York with one or both of the girls, depending on who's interested in it. And I want like $2,000 to spend on the in the fashion district, no questions asked. And he was just like laughing at me. He's like, do we really want to teach our daughter this, that you just spend so much money on fabric? And I was like, well, if she spends it on that, she won't have money for drugs, so it'll be okay.
It's true. It's true.
That's the joke that everybody always makes, right?
Yeah. Got to support the sewing habit, right?
For sure. All right. So anything going on that you need to chat about where people can find you?
Yeah. You know, my website is designerjoi.com. So you can go there. I have a newsletter. We usually only send that out once, maybe twice a month. So that has the latest. We're just going to launch a new class this week. So that'll be coming out. And it'll be a draping class. It will be an online Zoom retreat. And so it'll be 4 days in July. So we'll have morning sessions and then a lunch break and then an afternoon. I'm going to incorporate some of those live evaluations. So those that want, you know, hey, can you evaluate my work? So there'll be more about that. So that'll be good. I do have Perfect Pattern and Fit Club. That's my paid club. And that's where like are really, not that it's like hardcore core, but those are like my students that really love my method and my teaching approach and what we're doing. And I told them this year in a good way, I'm like, quote, hand holding in a good way, in that, like I mentioned earlier, we're doing a core project each quarter, but each week there's worksheets. And instead of like sitting down and feeling like, I don't know what to do, or like I have to sew for 3 hours, I do a small lesson each week that has some support materials. And then we've got Zooms. And so really it's giving them a minimal amount that they need to do in the process of the garment. So really in 3 months time, and you can do as much or as little of the process other than the sewing, like you have to do that. But really like in 3 months time, right now we're exploring the basic sleeveless tunic. And so like in 3 months time, like that's a good amount of time that the average person, you know, barring any major health crisis or something that, you know, the average person could do. And then we'll do skirts, and then we are going to do our tailored jacket in quarter 3. So the one you were referencing will be doing all the interfacing and all that fun stuff, followed with pants. So that's on my website. And I do free Facebook Live every Thursday at 1 o'clock. So that's on my designer Joi Mahon Facebook page, and that's free. And we're actually going to start a mock Chanel jacket. So that would be a really good one for you to do, Stephanie. So it'll be, I have the curriculum. I think I have 8, might be 9 weeks. So it's just a different step each week. We'll cover the fitting. And like I said, that's free. So that would be really fun for all of your audience, and also a great project for any of you that want to do like a quilted jacket. So if you want to incorporate some of that, you will totally have the freedom to do that. Yeah, so those are kind of some things that I'm doing. Working on another potential book title too. So there's always, you know, in the creative industry, there's always fun things going on as well. And working with my custom clients too. So
there's always irons in the fire. Like we're talking about content for like August and September right now. Like it's
and you plan so far ahead. So yeah.
And I'm gonna have to join in on that jacket for sure.
I
just got like a mock one from H&M, and the fit is just, not to knock H&M, I love H&M, but the fit is like not working for me at all, not at all. And I'm like, okay, well, we're gonna have to return this one and get something else. But to know that like there's a possibility of like making it work for you, like that would be so fun. And quilted jackets are so in right now.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And they can be like very literally quilted, or you can highlight just like a single quilt block on the back. I mean, there's so many things that you can do with that. So,
well, thank you again for taking some time with me. And we'll make sure to have the copies on our website so that folks can get them there.
Thank you so much. It was nice to be featured and nice to talk with you. And hello to everyone in your audience.